Hello, Bob Riedfeld here, preaching and teaching minister of the Spring Hill Christian Church of rural Oak Lockney, Georgia. And welcome to another lesson, lesson number 6, on the New Testament survey of the New Testament. We completed last time all of the Gospels, with the book of John being the last one. And today what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the book of Acts. We're going to go into another section of the Gospels where we have just one section, one book in this section. It's the history of the early church and Christianity. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in just a few moments. But if you want to have pen and paper ready, or however you take notes, go ahead and do that if you haven't done so already. And we're going to talk about the book of Acts today. And so I've got... I couldn't find my one outline for the book of Acts, so I've used a different thing, notes from different books that I have concerning the book of Acts. I took that as a whole class by itself. And so it may be just a little bit different of a format than the rest of the books that I've chosen, the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. But so what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and study the book of Acts, just give you kind of a brief overview of what that entails. And first thing is the title of the book. The title of the book, most of you probably know that there are different titles, Acts, just the Acts of the Apostles, Acts of the Holy Spirit, just kind of depending on the version of the Bible that you use. Just note that the title of the book is not what is inspired. They usually, for identification purposes, they put those little tags on there, and there are various reasons why they chose different works. The title Acts of the Apostles is generally not believed to not be given to the title as the title of the book by the author himself. Acts of the Apostles is a good one, but the Acts of the Apostles sometimes, I'm not sure it's a good title because the book of Acts doesn't record all of the acts of all of the apostles, and so just the Acts or Acts is probably a good name for that. The purpose for which the book was written is, someone said, conservative scholars have suggested that there was the need of authoritative information concerning the activity of the leading apostles, the need of showing that the Christian movement was one movement with believers, whether they were Jews or proselytes or Samaritans or Gentiles. It shows how Jewish and Gentile believers are related to each other in the church. And then the need of the setting of Paul's experiences, especially his arrest and imprisonment, in the right light, and the need for showing that God bore witness with the apostles. The primary purpose, however, I think was to give the world a record of the establishment of the church, and also information on how to become a Christian. As far as the authorship is concerned, who wrote Acts? There are two lines of evidence that we use to identify the human penman of the books of the New Testament. Those are the external evidence and then the internal evidence. And so we see allusions to the book of Acts. They don't appear frequently early in the first century, but there are some allusions to it the very early part of the second century, the 130s, 140s, and through time it was accepted as early as that as being an authoritative book that was written as part of the biblical canon. The internal evidence, the author does not sign his name, but the we sections that are found there indicate that the author was one of Paul's companions, and all the book was written by the same author. The internal evidence thus agrees with the external, saying that the author is Luke, the physician. who was indeed one of Paul's companions, as we learn from his being named in the epistles. So that's just a little bit about the title and the author. The language in Acts is good Greek, Koine Greek, but it's very good Greek. And the date of writing is probably somewhere between 60 AD and 63 AD, a couple of years after Luke wrote his gospel. We know it's written to the same person, Theophilus. The place of the writing, it was written in Rome, even though those who deny the authenticity agree with the conclusion that Rome is the place of the writing. Acts chapter 1:1 tells us the destination. It addresses the letter to Theophilus, who probably was the patron of this book, just as he was of the gospel. The patron bore the cost of having the book published. The book also, in the providence of God, is intended for all the church, as is evidenced by its inclusion in the New Testament, in order that the church would have an inspired history of her beginning and of the early spread of Christianity. Some of the characteristics of the book of Acts is that there are a number of striking features about the book. It is a great missionary book. It recounts the founding of the church. It tells of the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. It is the inspired history of the first 30 years of the church's growth. Acts is also the inspired record of the Advent mission and operations of the Holy Spirit. And the book furnishes the background for at least 10 of Paul's epistles. We find here the historical setting for 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, and Philippians. And as we think that Paul is the author of Hebrews, and that the book of Acts furnishes the background for the writing of Hebrews, we suppose from the first Roman imprisonment. And so here we have the book of Acts, and I want to just go ahead and kind of give some things. What it does do, it shows us kind of a Luke's orderly manner of presentation is really right good. It gives the ministry of Peter and the ministry of Paul. And so first, it talks about Peter began his ministry with the healing of the lame man in chapter 3, verse 6. People sought for Peter's shadow to fall on them for healing. We find that in 5:15. Peter and the sorcerer, Simon Magus, in 8:20. Tabitha raised from the dead in chapter 9, verse 32. Cornelius worshipped him, Acts chapter 10, verse 25. Peter in the Sanhedrin, supported by Gamaliel, a Pharisee, in Acts chapter 5, verse 34. Stephen is stoned in chapter 7, verse 58. Peter miraculously is released from prison in Acts 5:19, and Peter's vision of the sheet that's recorded 3 times is in Acts chapter 10, and then Peter being beaten, Acts chapter 5, verse 40. It also gives a good order things for the ministry of Paul, first called Saul, but later called Paul. Chapter 14, verse 8 and following, helped the lame man at Lystra. People took aprons and handkerchiefs away from Paul for healing in 19:12. Chapter 19, verse 12. Paul and the sorcerer Bar-Jesus in chapter 13:8. Eutychus raised from the dead, chapter 20, verses 9 through 12. Paul is worshipped at Lystra in Acts 14:13. Paul is supported by the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, chapter 23, verses 6 and 7. And Paul is stoned in chapter 14, verse 19. He's miraculously released from prison by the Philippian jailer in 1626. His vision of Christ is recorded 3 times in chapter 9, verse 22 and verse 26. And then Paul is beaten in Acts chapter 16, verses 22 through 23. And so Luke gives a generality, and then he gives incidents, both good and bad, to illustrate the generality. For example, they all had all things in common, he writes, and then he gives Barnabas as the good example and Ananias and Sapphira as the bad example. Luke is very exact. In the first 12 chapters, there are Semitisms, Hebrew idioms, or manners of expression showing through the Greek. And this is natural, since the chapters deal with events in Palestine. After the 12th chapter, the Semitism stopped, and some have argued that this indicates a change of source and that Luke now is copying from a different source. But that's absolutely not true. Luke is such a master writer that he does this deliberately. Aristotle speaks of such a change as being katakon, or appropriate. It would detract from the value of a modern history if you had a man from Brooklyn talking like a Southern belle. Luke, too, knew the difference, and he was very carefully putting them in. There's honesty and fidelity to the truth, and that Luke records the shortcomings of the church. He unblushingly tells of the hypocrisy of Ananias and Sapphira, the contention between Paul and Barnabas over Mark, the discontent at Jerusalem among the Hellenistic widows, and of the conflicts with the Judaizers. The characters in the book of Acts are introduced before they become prominent. First, we see a glimpse of a person, and later in the details we see are filled in. Saul is introduced in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, before he becomes prominent in chapter 9 and following, and 13 and following. The same is true of Barnabas and Stephen and Philip and John Mark. Acts is a book of particulars. Luke is very careful in the particular details. For example, 110 names are given. Indeed, this is a very trustworthy history. Every evidence points to this fact. The language I said is in Greek and written around 60 AD. It's just a history of the early church and the early Christianity, how to become a Christian, the introduction of the Holy Spirit as he now will indwell all believers. So that's an outline of the book of Acts. If you want to know a little bit more about the history of Christianity in the church, I would recommend that you read that particular passage of the scriptures. But that's going to be our lesson for today, the book of Acts, in our lesson series, the New Testament Survey, or Survey of the New Testament. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this presentation as much as I have enjoyed giving it. So I just hope that you have a great weekend, and may God bless you.